When it comes to mending relations, when it comes to saying sorry, you need to approach the situation with quite a bit of humility, don't you? You need to put down your pride and let the other party know you were wrong. Now, that is the first step. And if you can accomplish that, then maybe you can reset the relationship. Maybe you can steer the ship to where you want it to go. But somehow, the United States has dropped the ball yet again. And this time, with the most vital country on planet Earth. We're, of course, talking about Saudi Arabia. And by now, we kind of know the situation that's brewing in the Middle East. Now, ever since America's chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Gulf states has been asking themselves a ton of questions, right? They have been losing a ton of faith. Can the Americans really protect us? Are they committed to the Middle East? And then you have the famous argument over oil. OPEC, led by Saudi Arabia, shocked the oil markets in 2022, cutting production by 2 million barrels a day. We know that. Now, instead of increasing America's own oil production, Biden, he made a grave mistake. He vowed consequences for Saudi Arabia, which never came. And what do you think those two events led to? A power vacuum in the Middle East, of course, and it's one that China is rapidly moving to close. They sense blood in the water, and this is a golden opportunity to rebuild the world order. Now, this, of course, is freaking the United States out. That's why Anthony Blinken was sent all the way to Riyadh to visit MBS to try and normalize relations. America wants to be back in Saudi Arabia's good books, but the entire visit was a nothing burger, with Saudi Arabia not committing to anything. In fact, the Saudi foreign minister told Blinken the reality of today's multipolar world. It's really a message that the US is no longer in control. Now, listen to this statement in a joint news conference. China is our largest trading partner, so naturally, there's a lot of interaction and intersection with China. That cooperation is likely to grow just because China's economic impact in the region and beyond is likely to grow as its economy continues to grow. And this is groundbreaking because Saudi Arabia's economic future lies with China, it lies with Asia, and not really the West. And this is disastrous, especially for the US dollar, because Saudi Arabia is the key to the petrodollar's fate. Now, if Saudi support fully swings to China and to the BRICS nations, we'll see American economic influence drain further and further away, not just from the Middle East. The dollar will lose its power across the entire world. And let's understand the multiple storms that are converging on the US economy. Now, everything's looking fine and dandy in the US today. The S&P has surged to a new bull market led by tech stocks. Plus, the dollar is still the world reserve currency by a big margin. But if America stands still, if they do nothing, things are going to get really ugly really fast. The US economy is still facing a recession in 2023, and the other threat is even more severe. And that is the de-dollarization trend that's getting from bad to worse. So let's take a closer look at the US economy because things aren't looking too good. The reason why the world is slipping to a recession is because of higher prices driven by oil. The consumer is getting crushed. Now, if we look at the recent job numbers, it looks like the US economy is booming. We have insane job creation with the payrolls data gaining 339,000 jobs in May. That is a 3-month high. But is that really genuine growth? Sure, unemployment is still only at 3.7%, but are more people really thriving or just working more to survive? These are serious questions that we need to ask. Big retailers are now predicting a recession because the American consumer is broke. A big pullback in spending is coming, and this could just implode the US economy. And according to the Financial Times, Dollar General shares plunged 20% after gloomy sales forecasts. And this is serious business, guys. Dollar General is a discount retailer. It isn't some luxury brand. It isn't Tiffany and Co. If their revenue is dropping, this tells us that the American consumer is collapsing. Inflation is still a big crisis, and that is driven by oil prices. The immediate danger is a recession. But if we stretch the time horizons further, things get even bleaker, especially for the US dollar. The dollarization is no longer a trend, and things are really bad when you have the world's most powerful bank, JP Morgan, admitting that the dollarization is getting worse. Pulling up a story from Business Insider, the dollarization signs are emerging as the greenback slides in currency reserves. Now, central banks, they are ditching the US dollar, with the reserve currency dropping to a record low of 58%. Now, we have said many times that central banks, They are running away from dollars to gold, but now we have concrete figures to hang our heads on. Gold now comprises 15% of total assets versus the dollar's 44%. Just 5 years ago, gold was only 11%. And this is a clear sign that trust in the dollar is eroding. But pay attention to this next piece of information. Is a big reason why Blinken was sent scrambling all the way to Saudi Arabia. He is on a mission to save the dollar. According to JP Morgan, the dollarization is evident in FX reserves where USD share has declined to a record as share in exports decline, but is still emerging in commodities. And that is the next shoe to drop. The dollarization in commodities hasn't really happened yet. This means the majority of commodities, especially oil, are still priced in US dollars. But unless the United States does something soon, the dollarization in commodities is going to accelerate, and there will be disaster for the United States. And by now, we kind of understand the stakes. The US can't afford to lose Saudi Arabia to China and the BRICS. It is as good as giving them the keys to the kingdom, giving them the power to control the world economy. And if you were Blinken, you would probably kiss the ring and do what the Saudis want. It's in America's interest to get the Saudis on your side. This trip came on the back of the kingdom, cutting another million barrels a day of oil production once again. But what did the United States do during the trip? They decided to give a speech on human rights to the Saudis, which is totally bizarre. Everyone knows the agenda here is all about the economy and the dollar, but you went to preach human rights. Doesn't really make sense. Isn't there a better time for that? Now just take a look at a photo between Blinken and MBS and it shows you everything. Blinken looks like he just won the PGA Tour and he is incredibly proud. But just look at the face of MBS. He is 1,000 miles away. His mind just isn't in the room. He is just thinking to himself, what am I even doing here? According to Blinken, it is in Saudi Arabia's interest to continue to pursue this modernization, including the expansion of human rights. But you kind of get a sense that the kingdom is tired of US foreign policy. And in the statement when asked about Riyadh's human rights record, the Saudi minister, he clapped back. We are always open to having a dialogue with our friends, but we don't respond to pressure. When we do anything, we do it in our own interest. So it's very clear that Saudi Arabia isn't buying what Blinken is selling. So the meeting has essentially gone nowhere. Now, what Blinken is also trying to do is to broker another peace deal in the Middle East. He's trying to follow China's example of bringing Saudi Arabia and Iran together. But this time, he wants to do it with Israel, which is an insanely tall order. Now, it might be easier to colonize Mars or to build a Death Star than for Washington to broker a peace deal. Now, because what MBS wants, the US will likely never agree on. Saudi Arabia wants a civilian nuclear program and security guarantees from the United States. They want to eventually become a nuclear power in the region. And what do you think are the chances of the US Congress really approving this? I would say slim to none, and Slim just left the building. We already have the Israeli energy minister opposed to this idea. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. But even if that happens, it doesn't change the fact that Saudi Arabia's economy is moving closer to China and the BRICS nations. There's no stopping this train. Now, there's a very clear reason why the Saudis and at least a dozen other nations are looking to join the BRICS bloc. Actually, there are two big reasons that the US just can't overcome. Now, the first is a rising economy. The BRICS nations have overtaken the collective West, the G7, when it comes to the GDP. And this is very important because a rising GDP signals more industrial growth and hence more energy consumption. Look at the trajectory of the GDPs. It's a really terrifying picture for the West. You have economic growth in the G7 headed down, while the BRICS nations are soaring up. And with each passing year, the gap just gets bigger and bigger. So just ask yourself, if you're Saudi Arabia, what would you do? Your biggest customers are in Asia. America has not been a significant buyer of Saudi oil for a very long time. And I want us to consider this economic reality. Just in 2020 alone, Saudi Arabia is running a trade surplus with China. They are making money trading with the Chinese. Saudi Arabia exported $33.4 billion worth of goods to China, 74% of which comes from crude oil. That is Saudi Arabia's number one export. And if we fast forward to 2022, Saudi Arabia was the top crude supplier to the Chinese. So we have to sit back and smell the coffee. Saudi Arabia knows where the future of the trade lies. It isn't with the West, but with the East. It's really the same with business anywhere. If you have one client or one region that drives the majority of your revenue, don't you think they have greater bargaining power with you? And in Saudi Arabia's case, it's not like trade with the US or the Eurozone will suddenly reverse and grow. From an economic standpoint, it looks like America has abandoned Saudi Arabia. Looking at US and China trade with the kingdom, the trend is super obvious. Even a blind monkey can see the trajectory. In 2012, America was trading a lot with the Saudis. They were still buying a ton of oil from the Saudis back then. But as time went on, we can see that China has replaced the US as the kingdom's top trading partner. In fact, trade today between Beijing and Riyadh is 3 times more than with Washington. So any economic leverage the US had in the past is all but gone. And if we rope in the BRICS nations as a whole, Saudi Arabia's trade has gone from $81 billion in 2017 to over 160 billion in 2022. That's a doubling of trade in just 5 years. But this relationship goes well beyond just the financial incentives. The kingdom is sick and tired of America pushing their foreign policy agenda with everything. Their foreign minister, Prince Faisal, made a statement that underlined this. He explained how Saudi Arabia shares basic values with the BRICS countries, one of which is non-interference, and that is the sticking point. BRICS is all about trade and business, about the economy, but America's agenda always tries to push its own values on other countries, and Blinken's visit to MBS clearly shows that. So, what does this mean? It shows that the US economy and the dollar is still in the danger zone. They have lost control of the oil markets, and the power of the reserve currency is fast slipping away. And how do we know this? Because Biden has decided to refill the strategic petroleum reserves. The Department of Energy is moving to purchase 3 million barrels of crude for the SPR, signaling the end of the fight. This comes on the back of a massive drawdown of US energy reserves to a 40-year low. Just look at this tremendous drop in oil reserves. This was when Biden decided to fight OPEC on the open market. It obviously didn't work. And unless America really pumps more oil, they can no longer control the direction of the oil markets. But here's the big threat to the dollar. If we track the biggest oil exporters in the world, the number one spot goes to Saudi Arabia. And within the top 10, the majority of which are producers in the Middle East. And we know for sure Russia doesn't want to sell their energy in dollars anymore, especially after the sanctions. Plus, now we have the Saudis, the UAE, and Iran all looking to join BRICS. It's the perfect storm for bilateral trade. It's very likely down the road, either one of these countries will break from the petrodollar system. And if it happens to be Saudi Arabia that accepts other currencies, then all hell will break loose for the dollar. And this is how bad things can really get. According to Ray Dalio, the United States is at the beginning of a late big cycle debt crisis. And why is this the case? Because the US is producing too much debt and there's a shortage of buyers. This means eventually the debt bubble is going to pop if America can't find new buyers for US treasuries. And remember where we are now in this debt crisis. The debt ceiling has been suspended until January 2025. The day of reckoning has been postponed for another 18 months. There will be another debt ceiling crisis down the road, and this is where Saudi Arabia comes in. If the Saudis decide to break with the petrodollar, it sets into motion a series of events that will make the debt crisis even worse. And let's dive a little deeper into why America can't afford to let the petrodollar system break. It is a core pillar that's keeping the dollar system up. And in order to keep the American economy going, we know the US government has to borrow a lot of money from domestic and foreign investors. They issue a ton of bonds to the American people and other countries as well. Now, that is fine. When interest rates are low, they can keep kicking the can down the road. But look at bond yields today. The 10-year yield has gone from 0.5% to nearly 4%. That's 7 to 8 times more borrowing costs, 8 times more interest that the US government has to pay on the debt. So just imagine if Saudi Arabia decides to price oil away from dollars. Suddenly, there's less incentive to hold dollars in reserves, and this means demand for US treasuries will gradually drop. It might be a trickle at first, but it will get more severe as time goes on. And I want us to see things this way. The more oil is priced away from dollars, the greater the hit is to treasury demand. It'll be a gut punch after gut punch. They'll push the debt crisis closer towards a default. And this means the Federal Reserve will likely step in as the buyer of last resort to prop up the bond markets. Money printing will be back. And that's why Blinken's trip to Saudi Arabia is more or less a non-event. I think Saudi's move towards the BRICS bloc is all but guaranteed. It's just a matter of time now. And let's absorb two pieces of news that tells us this move is coming. The first, of course, is Saudi Arabia moving to join the BRICS Bank. They aren't joining the bank for fun, guys. It's obvious what the Saudis are really planning to do. They want to start raising money outside of the dollar and investing more in emerging markets. And in other words, they are diversifying away from the Western capital system, from the Western capital markets. Saudi Arabia is moving towards Asia and the developing world because that is the future. Now, the second is the opening of Iran's embassy in Saudi Arabia for the first time in 7 years. This isn't just a win for the Saudis or the Iranians, it's a win for China and the BRICS nations. It actually paves the way for both Saudi Arabia and the Iranians to join the bloc. So I'm not sure if Blinken's trip could really change the course of history. I'm not sure if the US can normalize Saudi-Israel relations either, but what I am sure of is how de-dollarization is beyond the point of no return. No one can dispute that, and it's just a matter of sooner or later. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Was Blinken's trip a success or failure? Is it game over for the US dollar? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, be sure to smash the like button and subscribe as we navigate through these crazy times.